For today's video, I've finally gotten my hands on the refreshed 2020 Kia Niro plug-in hybrid. The plug-in hybrid is the middle child in the Niro lineup. There's a hybrid without a plug if you'd rather go that direction, and there is a full EV available as well, although it's not available in all 50 states. For some folks out there, plug-in hybrids like this and like the Prius Prime are the ultimate in compromise, because fuel economy is quite logically going to be a little bit lower than the hybrid without the plug. This particular model comes in at 46 miles per gallon versus 50 miles per gallon for the most efficient version of the hybrid model. And electric range is logically going to be much shorter than the full EV as well. 26 miles in this model versus almost 240 in the EV version. But personally, I think that looking at plug-in hybrids like this and the Prius Prime in this way is missing the point. The plug-in hybrid version of this and the plug-in hybrid version of the Prius Prime are very pragmatic vehicles because batteries are a limited quantity in the world right now. So in theory, if you wanted to take a holistic look at energy consumption and moving some of that consumption over from gasoline to electricity, then plug-in hybrids like this make more sense, and it's logical to build more of these than full battery electric vehicles. Even though the electric range on this model is not a flashy 200 or 300 miles, 26 miles is enough for the average American to complete their daily commute fully in electric mode. And if you wanted to take a longer trip, you have a range of 560 miles, electricity and gasoline combined. And perhaps more importantly, the plug-in hybrid version of the Niro may actually be less expensive than the hybrid version. This does start at $29,490, higher than the hybrid's $24,990 starting price, but this qualifies for a $4,500 federal tax credit and additional state and local incentives. So depending on the state that you're buying this in, it could be $400 more than the hybrid, or it could actually be thousands of dollars less. This will also allow you access to California and other states' HOV lanes. Be sure and check your local laws on that one, but that's another reason that you might want to get the plug-in hybrid instead. Up front, there's not too much difference between the hybrid and the plug-in hybrid. We have the latest interpretation of Kia's Tiger Nose grille. This is a very geometric shape going on right there. We have full LED projection headlamps up here, and then these very interesting accent lights at the bottom. The grille's kind of interesting because when you take a closer look, you'll notice that most of this grille really doesn't do anything. This entire upper section right here, the entire middle section, no air flows through there. Really just this small section right here is a grate, and then we have the air intake lower on the bumper. That's because plug-in hybrids and hybrids don't need as much cooling as conventional gasoline engine vehicles. Now it's time for what is that thing. At 171.5 inches long, Kia would sort of like you to call this a subcompact crossover. This is almost exactly the same size on the outside as the all-new Kia Seltos. But unlike the Seltos, this is available as a front-wheel drive vehicle only. And for some folks, that precludes calling this a small SUV or small crossover. Although, Toyota's trying basically the same thing with the Toyota CHR, which is incidentally almost the exact same length as this model, and certainly looks less like a crossover. Making things a little bit more funky is the fact that at 6.3 inches of ground clearance, this has more ground clearance than something like a Chevy Trax, even though it has available all-wheel drive, and this is actually higher off the ground than a base model Jeep Cherokee. Whatever you want to call the Niro, I think that the truest and closest competitors for this model are the Hyundai Ioniq and the Prius Prime, but this is shaped a little bit more like a pregnant hatchback, or again, a crossover, and I think that's why the Niro outsells its very closely related cousin, the Hyundai Ioniq. This is about 11 inches shorter than the Prius Prime, but this makes a case for being more practical. We have very similar cargo room in the back, and it's a little bit square, a little bit more practical, and we have more legroom and more headroom in the inside as well. Today we're looking at an essentially fully loaded version of the Niro plug-in hybrid, and we have 205 width tires. The reason for the narrower tires is efficiency. Clearly this is heavier than the regular hybrid. We have a battery pack that weighs nearly 260 pounds in the back, and that meant that they downsized the tires in order to help improve the fuel economy. That's how we end up at 46 miles per gallon combined for this model, not in the low 40s like you might expect. The mini crossover styling continues out back, where we get restyled partial LED tail lamp modules. The turn signals, even though they're red, they're not LEDs. And then we have these interesting accents back here that mimic what was going on up front with those chevron shapes, and this is where we find the backup lights. When it comes to active safety, Kia goes about things a little bit differently than the competition. Arguably, we have more active safety technology standard on this than we find in the average Toyota out there, but we find a few fewer convenience features standard. So for instance, Toyota is including radar adaptive cruise control in almost every model sold in North America. This has standard cruise control standard, not adaptive cruise control. That's an option. But we still have Kia's autonomous braking software with pedestrian detection, and they give us blind spot monitoring through cross-traffic detection standard, which is typically an option in the Toyota lineup. Under this hood, we find essentially the same 1.6-liter four-cylinder engine that we find in the hybrid without the plug, and incidentally, the Hyundai Ioniq as well. It's a 1.6-liter four-cylinder engine that produces 104 horsepower and 109 pound-feet of torque in its own right. It's then coupled to a 60 horsepower electric motor that produces an additional 125 pound-feet of torque. Because the output of the electric motor and the gasoline engine are not in perfect sync, they don't reach their peak at the same time, you can't simply add the outputs together and get a total. This hybrid system is a little bit easier to explain than the one that we find in the Prius Prime, because rather than using a planetary power split system or a dual motor system like we find in the Honda hybrids with the clutch, this has a pretty traditional 6-speed dual clutch transmission. That's basically an automated manual transmission. They're using that for efficiency. The 60 horsepower electric motor is directly connected to the 6-speed transmission, so when this vehicle is driving electric only, you will feel it shift like a traditional automatic transmission vehicle. And that's why the feel of the Niro and the related Ioniq are very traditional car feeling. They feel very different than a Prius. Powering the 60 horsepower electric motor is an 8.9 kilowatt-hour lithium-ion battery pack that's good for a range of 26 miles in electric-only mode. And again, if you add the gasoline and the electric range together, you'll get 560 miles out of this drivetrain. Charging happens via the port located behind door number 2. There's an onboard 3.3 kilowatt charger that will charge this battery in just under 3 hours if you have access to a level 2 charging station. If you don't, then charging will take about 8 or 9 hours depending on exactly how low the battery is. I get asked frequently, why don't plug-in hybrids have faster onboard chargers or DC fast charge ports? The logical reason for that is cost and weight. Adding a DC fast charge port would add additional complexity to the vehicle, additional cost, and of course weight, as would bumping this up to, say, a 6.6 kilowatt charger. There's a bit of a cost-benefit analysis thing going on in a vehicle like this with a relatively low sticker price, but something that a lot of folks don't consider is the battery pack itself. This is a much smaller battery pack than we find in a full EV, and the battery pack size and capacity and number of cells has a direct impact on how fast you can charge the pack. So it may really not be possible to charge a battery this small too much faster. Going a little bit out of order, that battery pack is located right back here in the cargo area just under the load floor. The location of the battery pack gives this Niro a slightly better weight balance than we find in the non-plug-in version. This is a lithium-ion battery pack, but as we see in other plug-in hybrids, it is air-cooled, not liquid-cooled. That's again to help reduce the cost factor, and one of the reasons that we don't find faster charging options here, because that would simply stress out the battery a little bit too much. This battery occupies the entire area where a spare tire would go, so instead we get a tire mobility kit. Seating position is one of the reasons that you might want to get the Niro over the Prius Prime. Rather than feeling more car-like, this definitely feels more crossover-like. We have a more upright driving position and a slightly higher view of the road. Personally, I find this seating position to be a little bit more comfortable, and therefore I find these seats to be a bit more comfortable than the Prius Prime seats, although these are not any more adjustable. We have a 2-way adjustable lumbar support. I really wish we had a 4-way lumbar support there, and we have a manual tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion. We do have a 2-position seat memory over there on the driver's door. But in the name of cost and weight savings, we don't have a power passenger seat. It's manual only, and it doesn't have any adjustable lumbar. Rear seat accommodations are another reason you might want to get this over the Prius Prime. We certainly have more legroom in here, and we have a lot more headroom than we find in the average compact sedan. So if I sit back here and put my head against that headrest, I have about 2.5 inches of headroom left. It's worth noting that we find more headroom back here than we find in many of the subcompact crossover competition as well. And the roof is nice and square. That means that it's not arching in like we find in something along the lines of the Honda HR-V. Now this is still a relatively compact vehicle, technically a subcompact, and that means that if I move over to the middle seat position, there's not going to be as much room for 3 people across the rear bench. But thankfully, the center seat belt does come out of the seat itself, not out of the ceiling. That certainly makes the cargo area a bit more practical. If I scoot all the way over to the right side of the Niro, this front seat is all the way back in its tracks. I have about 1 inch of legroom left. If you're a taller driver or you have taller front passengers in your vehicle often, you might want to take a look at the Niro because the front seat tracks move an awful lot further rearward than many of its direct competitors. That's a feature that's not unique to the Niro. It's something that we see in a lot of Hyundai and Kia vehicles. They really have focused on front seat tracks that move a great deal further rearward and are therefore a bit more accommodating for taller folks up front. A nice touch in the rear that we don't find in all subcompact crossovers out there is that we actually have air conditioning vents for the rear seat passengers. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in the very top end trim, so obviously there are going to be things in here that we don't find in the base model. We have a pretty standard sized moonroof right here over the driver and front passengers' heads, height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, and 2-way adjustable headrests. The bulk of this interior remains unchanged for 2020, but there are a few subtle tweaks here and there until we get to the dashboard, which has some pretty major changes. We have Perforated seats here because we do have heated and ventilated seats available, a nice touch that we find at lower price points than many of the other hybrids and plug-in hybrids out there. As we move on over to the front doors, as you'd expect in an inexpensive vehicle, there's a high percentage of hard plastic going on here. But the doors do feature a soft touch upper section and a nice soft armrest right there. You'll find hard plastics down there by that speaker grille and of course the bottle holders at the bottom. The big change in here is the dashboard, which has been restyled for 2020. It's a little bit difficult to tell in this black trim section, but there is a pattern going on in there. We then have imitation metal trim below that. You'll find a soft touch upper section to the dashboard and then hard plastics lower. We have a bin style glove compartment on the passenger side, just barely too small to receive one of those larger tablet computers. At the top of the dashboard, we have a charging indicator light with 3 different LEDs to indicate the status of the charge as you're charging. And then below that, we find the available 10.25-inch touchscreen infotainment system. This is the biggest change really in this interior. In addition to being larger than the infotainment systems that we've seen in the Niro before, it's also a little bit better integrated into the dashboard. You can see it's at the same level as that black trim that runs all the way across from the passenger side all the way on over to the instrument cluster. As you'd expect out of a modern mainstream vehicle, this supports Apple CarPlay and Android Auto integration, and that smartphone integration occupies the entire screen, as you can see right there. This has the latest software package for infotainment systems from Kia, so this is very similar to what we see, for instance, in the Kia Telluride. But oddly, this system does not get wireless Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, which we are seeing deployed in some of the smaller infotainment systems in Kia's lineup. Below the infotainment system, we find the engine start-stop button, the controls for the dual-zone automatic climate control, and then some physical controls for that infotainment system. We have a single USB input for that right down there. Again, no wireless CarPlay, so that's why we have that phone connected right there. There's a USB charge-only port and a 12-volt power port down there as well. This area conceals a Qi wireless charge mat, but as you can see, you can't obviously put anything there with the cable connected. There's just barely enough room to put some of those larger smartphones on there in their case, however. Below that, we have a pretty traditional console shifter. This is also a little bit different than what we find in the Prius. There's a sport mode and a manual shift mode because, again, we do have a dual clutch transmission in there, so you can command gear changes. We have a hybrid EV mode selector. This allows us to choose between hybrid mode, EV mode, and an auto mode. We then have a button to disable the parking sensors. Behind that, we have 2 very large cup holders right here, buttons for the heated steering wheel, heated and ventilated seats, electric parking brake, and auto brake hold. In case you're wondering, the key is very similar to other recent Kia models where the buttons are on the side. We have a big lock button right there, and then we have buttons for the hatch and then the unlock button. This is not a powered hatch vehicle that just unlocks the hatch. Beneath the front seats, we have a softly padded center armrest that opens to reveal a moderately sized storage compartment. There are no charging ports inside, however. On the driver's side, we have a significantly updated instrument cluster. We have a large central LCD. The display does change if we enter the sport mode. So if I go ahead and put that in drive and then move over there to sport mode, you notice an animation, and then the tachometer becomes a bit more prominent. If I put it over there back into the drive mode, where the eco automatically engages, there's no separate drive mode button here, then we get a tachometer right over here on the side. On either side of the large LCD, we have LED displays. So these are not separate little LCDs right over here. They're just individual LED elements for the fuel gauge, the speed right there. And then over here, we have a power, eco, and charge gauge. The battery gauge on the left side works for both hybrid mode and EV mode. Basically, we've used almost the entire EV portion of this battery up, so we're just down there in the hybrid mode bars. The steering wheel features a round 3-spoke design with a split bottom spoke right down there. This one is leather wrapped. And then we have pretty aggressive sport grips up top for a hybrid. Also a little unusual for hybrid, we have paddles on the back of the steering wheel, and these are shift paddles. They're not regen braking paddles. On the right side of the steering wheel, we find the controls for the adaptive cruise control system. We also find a button and toggle for that multifunction LCD right there in the middle. And then on the left side, we have the buttons for the infotainment system. Out on the road, 60 horsepower may not sound like a great deal, but remember we get 125 pound-feet of torque from the electric motor, and that's more torque than we find in many entry-level subcompact vehicles, period. That allows this vehicle to cruise along at highway speeds in EV mode with absolutely no problem. 75 or even 80 miles an hour in EV mode is not an issue as long as you're on level pavement. Now at those higher speeds, clearly the gasoline engine is going to have to kick in order to get you up and over an incline, but the electric mode is a little bit more useful than the specs would otherwise indicate. Now in our 0 to 60 testing, this model ran 9.5 seconds when using the gasoline engine, and that stretches out to nearly 20 seconds if you're trying to stay in EV mode only. Those times are clearly on the longer side of things if we're taking a look at new cars in general, but versus something like the Prius Prime, they're pretty similar. And honestly, there are many subcompact crossovers out there without a hybrid system that are just about as slow as 0 to 60. As you'd expect out of a vehicle that has 205 width tires and a little bit of extra curb weight versus the non-plug-in hybrid version, it takes a bit longer for this to stop from highway speeds. 126 feet in this model, that is a little bit longer than the last top-end trim of the Niro hybrid we tested. The narrower tires also have an impact on the handling. I'm going to give this a B, bearing in mind that this is compared against the average subcompact crossover out there that's priced like this, and of course something like the Toyota Prius Prime. I do think this handles a little bit better than the Prius Prime. It's a little bit more engaging out on the road. Some of that has to do with the suspension design, some of it has to do with the drivetrain itself. But obviously, if you're looking for an excellent handling subcompact crossover, the Niro is not really going to be in the running, and that's not what this is trying to be either. So clearly the best handling subcompact crossovers are going to be something like the Mazda CX-30. Kia's own Seltos does incredibly well in that segment also. But all of those options are going to give you significantly lower fuel economy and of course no EV range at all. Trouble is, those are clearly not direct competitors. In reality, the more direct competitors to this would be the Prius Prime and of course the Hyundai Ioniq, which is closely related to this. I think the Ioniq handles a little bit better, but this definitely handles a little bit better than the Prius. Out on a rougher road like the one that we're on here, we do get a slightly better ride, I think, than the non-plug-in hybrid version of the Niro. That's because essentially we have the same tire size as the base version of the Niro, and that means that we get slightly higher profile tires that give us a little bit more cushion. Now we can still get some of the same sort of bobble-headed feel in here that you'd find in any subcompact vehicle out there, but it's no different than what we'd find in an HR-V or a Toyota CHR. In our cabin noise test at 50 miles an hour, we clocked 72 decibels in this cabin, so I'm going to give this a B. This is pretty similar to the average subcompact crossover out there. There's certainly going to be some quieter options, and there's certainly going to be some louder options as well. When it comes to fuel economy, I'm going to give this an A-. The Prius Prime is absolutely amazing when it comes to fuel efficiency. It is one of the most efficient vehicles, whether we're talking about a gasoline hybrid or a pure EV. Aerodynamics certainly play a big part of fuel efficiency, and this is not going to be as aerodynamic as the Prius or the related Hyundai Ioniq. I also spent a reasonable amount of time this week driving the plug-in hybrid, as I think most shoppers will, plugging in on one side of their daily commute. I drive up and over a 2,200-foot mountain pass, 26 miles each way to the office. So on one of those directions, I was able to use the battery to get almost completely to my destination, and then I had to use it as a regular hybrid to get the return trip in. Talking about combined fuel economy is a little bit tricky because according to the trip computer, the round trip average there was 101 mpg, but it's treating the electricity as if it was completely free. So essentially, yes, I did get 101 mpg, but I also used electricity, about 8.9 kilowatts in order to make that round trip. If you're looking for a hybrid or a plug-in hybrid that has a more traditional car feel to it, then the Niro is going to be an excellent option. Because we have that 6-speed dual clutch transmission, this feels like a car with a traditional automatic as you're driving it down the road. Now, because of this hybrid system design, regenerative braking does feel a little bit unusual, and that is something that you should know. Because in order to regenerate power back into the battery, the energy has to go from the wheels through the transmission to the electric motor. And as you're slowing down, the transmission has to downshift from 6th gear to 5th gear, 4th gear, etc. And that downshift feel means that if you're braking gently, the braking can feel like it's surging a little bit as the transmission is downshifting. Kia's done a good job at polishing that, but it is still going to be noticeable. It's also worth noting that if you're looking for a hybrid that allows you to have a lot of control over the hybrid system, this is going to be a great option as well, because we have a true manual mode to this system. So for instance, if I wanted to command 3rd gear and just loaf up this hill using a little bit of power from the engine and a whole lot of torque from the electric motor, I can do that with the shift paddles. If I want to run the battery completely down going up a hill, I can command 6th gear and just floor it all the way up the hill, not going terribly quick, but certainly using an awful lot of power from the battery. So if that's something that interests you, that's why you might want to get this. As with electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid comparisons tend to be a little all over the map because there aren't too many plug-in hybrids out there. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and price tags end up being pretty similar for very different kinds of vehicles. For 2020, the Niro plug-in starts at $29,490 and will go on up to a little bit over $36,000 if you get the top-end trim. Electric vehicle and plug-in hybrid vehicle tax credits are based on battery capacity, so the Niro qualifies for a $4,543 tax credit based on the capacity of the battery. That puts it about $300 over the regular non-plug-in version of the Niro. For that trade-off, you'll get 26 miles of electric range, 46 mpg once that is done, and 105 mpge when operating as an electric vehicle. You'll also have access to state and local incentives depending on the area of the country that you live in, and possibly HOV lane access as well. In California, for instance, for the first 3 years, you get to drive in the HOV lane absolutely by yourself if you buy a plug-in hybrid vehicle. The first thing to cover here is that the plug-in hybrid version of the Niro is an absolute no-brainer upgrade over the regular version of the Niro. If you're shopping for a Niro and the plug-in hybrid is right there on the dealer lot, I would say just get the plug-in hybrid. When all the credits and incentives are said and done, many people out there will actually end up paying less for the Niro plug-in hybrid than the non-plug-in hybrid, and they'll have access to the carpool lane in California. With that out of the way, let's dive into our first competitor, the Honda Clarity plug-in. It may seem odd to compare a plug-in hybrid midsize sedan to a plug-in subcompact hatchback, but they end up being right about the same price. The Clarity seems like it's more at $33,400, but remember, the tax credit is based on the size of the battery, so it qualifies for a $7,500 tax credit, not a $4,500 tax credit, and that brings its price pretty darn close to the Niro. That bigger battery also gets you a longer range, 47 miles of range in the Clarity, but then fuel economy drops off after the battery is depleted, 42 miles per gallon, and if you're driving higher speeds, you'll definitely notice the Clarity is less efficient. The big difference obviously between these two vehicles is that the Niro is a hatchback, so if you're looking for something that looks like a crossover, feels like a crossover, has that hatchback practicality, then that's going to be a good option for you. Meanwhile, the Clarity is a sedan, so it has a traditional trunk. The battery does impact cargo capacity a little bit back there, but it still has a trunk pass-through, and it's styled sort of like a futuristic 1980s midsize family sedan. It has the wheel skirts in the rear that some people really despise. Personally, I don't really mind them. And the interior is very, very comfortable. On the downside, the Clarity gets one of Honda's older infotainment systems. So if you're looking for newer gadgets, bigger screens, you're going to find those in the Niro. Even though the Clarity is definitely bigger than the Niro, Honda decided to give it more Accord-like performance and handling ability. So the Clarity is definitely going to out-handle and out-accelerate the Niro. Next up, we have the other plug-in hybrid from Japan, the Toyota Prius Prime. The Prime is incredibly focused on efficiency, and as a result, it's one of the most efficient vehicles you can buy when operating as a hybrid, and one of the most efficient vehicles you can buy when operating as an electric car. On the downside, it's an awful lot less peppy than most of the plug-in hybrids you'll find out there. The price tag is a little bit less than the Niro at $27,900, and it qualifies for a similarly sized federal tax credit, making most of the Prius Primes you'll see on the dealer lot effectively less expensive than the Niro. On the list of pros and cons for the Prius Prime, clearly on the pro side we have to have efficiency, reliability, the liftback practicality, although that's not quite as practical as the hatchback style that we have in the Niro. On the con side, it's a little bit less practical, it's less exciting to drive, and it's not quite as fast 0 to 60, although the Kia Niro is not exactly speedy either. I think the biggest competitor for the Niro is its very close cousin, the Hyundai Ioniq. The two vehicles have very similar warranties. They have the identical powertrain. Hyundai and Kia developed these two vehicles together. They have the same battery as well, but the Ioniq is less expensive at $26,500, notably less expensive than the Niro. Making things trickier because they have the same battery, they both get the same tax credit, and the Ioniq tops out less than the Niro as well at $32,950 versus just over $36,000 for the Niro. In addition to being less expensive, the Ioniq will also give you longer EV range thanks to its greater aerodynamics, and of course better fuel economy, again thanks to its better aerodynamics, even though we have the same hybrid system. The Ioniq also got a recent refresh, giving it basically the same infotainment systems and electronic systems that we find in the Kia Niro. But because the Ioniq is about $4,000 less, without giving up too much real practicality, if I were shopping, I would probably buy the Ioniq over the Niro. I like the way the Niro looks a little bit more than the Ioniq, but the Ioniq is less expensive and it gives you the same hybrid system. At this point in time, if I were shopping for an inexpensive plug-in hybrid in America right now, the Clarity would definitely be on my shopping list, but I think that I would get the Ioniq over the Clarity. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. I love the Clarity. It has a great ride, it's quiet inside, it's big inside as well, but it's not as practical as the liftback options, and in real-world fuel efficiency, it's not going to be as efficient as a hybrid as something like the Ioniq or even the Kia Niro. I like the way the Niro looks, but the Ioniq is about $4,000 less, and it gives you a very similar experience, only more efficient with longer EV range. So if I were shopping for one of these guys right now, I would probably get the Ioniq. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section, and I'll see all of you later. Be sure and find us over at facebook.com/AlexNautas so you can see what I'm driving this week, over at Instagram as well. Bye.